let them introduce themselves once they get on. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm the program coordinator in Marshall County. So I work with youth and adult both, actually. So I do master gardener stuff, ag stuff. I work in gardens a lot, a little bit of everything. And I've been here in Extension for about 4.5 years now. So I've been trying to do some more on the ag side, and we're going to start by doing some beef programming tonight. So I'm pretty excited about that. So that I know that Dylan isn't here yet, so he can't introduce himself. But Wyatt and Brinley, if I pronounce that right, you want to introduce yourselves really quick?
My name is Wyatt. I'm in 7th grade and I show calves and sheep.
I'm Brinley. I'm in 4th grade and I'm going to show calves.
Very nice. And then Dylan, who's going to join after wrestling practice. Ooh, I don't remember how old he is. 7th grade-ish, I think I looked the other day.
Dylan is a freshman.
Okay. So
before his
right, it's a little hard to hear you, Sarah. I don't know.
Sorry, Dylan is a freshman, and he shows
freshman. Well, I was a little off, boy. Oof. Okay. All right. Well, when he hops on, let him say hey when he gets on if he wants to. So I do want to let you guys know that I am recording this for the sake of those who couldn't be on tonight, because I know the Guthries were unsure if they were going to all hop on at once tonight. So I will have this recorded and sent to you guys for you guys to look back onto if you want to review some of the information. And I'm going to just turn my camera off and let Chris have it, but don't be afraid to turn your guys' camera on as well if you guys want to later on. All right, go ahead.
All right, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
I can anyway.
Okay, sounds good. So my name's Chris Clark, and I am a beef specialist with Iowa State University. And Chelsea asked me to talk with you tonight about a couple different topics. We're going to talk a little bit about beef carcass beef carcass evaluation and kind of understanding what the beef carcass data means. And we'll probably talk just a little bit then about some nutrition and management things to help promote good carcass performance in your calves. And then if we have time, we'll talk just a little bit about record keeping. So I was thinking and hoping we'd have at least part of this in person. And so I know it's a little bit different doing it by Zoom, but if you guys do have questions, I want it to be pretty relaxed, pretty interactive. So feel free to stop me and ask questions if you'd like.
I will monitor the chat too. So the chat's in the very bottom if you don't know where it's at. So I will monitor that if you don't want to speak up at the time. I'll watch those.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chelsea. That will help because I don't see the chat right now with my presentation up. But so I am a veterinarian by schooling, but I work full-time for ISU Extension now as a beef specialist. And been doing this job for about 8 years now. And keep in mind that when I put this together, I wasn't exactly sure how old all of you would be and how much experience you all might have with beef. So if any of this seems like too advanced or like too much, just let me know, ask for help. If you need me to explain something, I can sure try to do that. So we're going to dive right in, and you guys, like I said, feel free to ask questions and stuff. So this presentation started as something that I do as an educational presentation, usually right after county fair season. So a lot of times we'll have programs where exhibitors can get carcass data back about their animals. And sometimes it's actually part of a contest. Maybe it's a carcass contest, or at the state fair, we have what we call the Beef of Merit contest. And basically I try to go through and help people understand all the numbers, because when you finish a contest like that, or you get your carcass data back, you typically get like a chart or a spreadsheet with just lots of numbers. And it's just helpful sometimes to go through and explain a few of those things. In this context, though, I tried to put some pictures and stuff too to make it just a little more interesting. But there's three basic things that we look at when we evaluate a beef carcass. The first one I listed as hot carcass weight. So that's just literally how much the carcass weighs after they've removed the head, the hide, the feet, and then a lot of the internal organs. So the abdominal organs probably weigh the most and take up the most space. And the rumen would be an example of that. Remember, cattle have 4 compartments to the stomach, and the rumen is a really large one that gets full of feed and water, and it can be quite heavy. So that stuff's all removed before we take the carcass weight. There's still some bone and some fat involved there, but we're trying to get an estimate of how much actual product there is. Then there's a thing called the yield grade, and I'll teach you how that is calculated and stuff. But again, that tries to kind of estimate how much meat is there. That does that by kind of comparing how much muscle there is to how much fat there is on the animal. And then quality grade is when we look at basically how good the meat is going to be. And so by doing that, we're trying to estimate value of the meat and predict, you know, how good it will taste, how juicy it will be, how flavorful it will be, that kind of thing. The way they do that is they look at intramuscular fat or marbling, and I'll teach you what that means tonight too. Okay, so this is a picture at like a packing plant with lots of carcasses hanging. If you ever go to a show where the judge says, you know, this calf will do well on the rail, what he means is he will do well at slaughter. Okay, and what they do is after the animal is killed or humanely put down, like I said, they remove the head, the hide, the feet, and the internal organs. And then they actually split the carcass in half long ways, and they hang the halves usually on a big hook like this that's hooked in by the hock joint, the kind of that angled joint of the back leg, and they hang it on a rail like this. And then hopefully you can appreciate, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, that right in here you can see the rib cage of the animal. And then up here would be the spine. So these are the bones of the back. And typically what they do so that we can look at the ribeye muscle and do some measurements is they rib it, they call it, but it's basically cutting between the 12th and 13th rib. Somewhere right in here, starting on the side of the back. And this picture is bad. I know it's blurry, but that's a closer up picture of what they do there. You can see that they've split right here. And this is a nice clear picture from a local locker after a county fair, but this is kind of what that looks like after it's been split or ribbed between the 12th and 13th rib. That's a nice picture of the ribeye muscle. So the ribeye steak is actually from the longissimus dorsi muscle. It's a long, thick muscle that runs on either side of the spine. And that's what we use to do a lot of the carcass measurements. So that's a nice picture. You can clearly see the outline of that ribeye. And then right over here, you can see what we call the back fat or the cover fat. And so that's another measurement that we take. And then all the little white pieces of tissue inside the red, that's what we call intramuscular fat or marbling. So this is a picture of measuring the ribeye muscle. And there's a clear plastic grid that you set down on the ribeye. And you just count the dots that are actually over top of the red muscle tissue. and it's calibrated so that every dot is 1/10 of a square inch. So basically you count the dots, you divide by 10, and that gives you the measurement of the ribeye in square inches. And then we measure that back fat, typically using a little ruler, whether it's stainless steel or sometimes on that plastic grid, there's a little ruler on the edge of that. This is actually a lamb. I couldn't find a good picture of this in a beef carcass. And this one, they don't split the carcass. So actually, this is one side, and this is kind of the center. The other ribeye would be over here. But the principle is the same, and they measure that back fat in inches, just like they do in beef cattle. And then this picture is showing something called KPH fat, or kidney pelvic heart fat. It's a little hard to see, but hopefully if you look like right in this area, and then on this side, it's going to be right up in this area. That's kind of the pelvic region. And then right down in here would be the area of the kidney. The heart would typically be up here in the rib cage area in the chest cavity, but that's been removed. But hopefully you can see that on this picture, there's more white tissue here than in the same place on the other picture. And that's just kind of looking for that fat content of the kidney area, the pelvic area, and then if the heart is there, around the heart. It's kind of a subjective thing, kind of just personal opinion, a little bit of the grader. And it's reported as a percent, and I'm honestly not sure if that's percent of body weight or body fat, percent of carcass weight maybe. But generally it ranges from about 1 to 4, somewhere in there. And so as a grader, you kind of get a feel for it over time. But I think, if I remember right, this one was called like a 1. And then this one over here was called like a 3.5 or a 4. So this would have more fat content in that kidney and pelvic area as opposed to the other picture. Okay, so every once in a while, I'm going to have you guys participate a little bit. I'm going to ask you a question or two. So this is your first chance to participate. Is fat good or bad on your beef animal? Like if you have a 4-H steer or a market heifer, is fat good or bad?
Good.
I heard one person say good. Was that you, Wyatt?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Brinley, did you try to answer? I thought I saw your microphone.
She's being shy.
Okay. That's okay.
Say what you think.
Good and bad.
Okay, good and bad. So, Brinley, do you want to explain that? And if not, that's okay, but you're exactly right.
No.
Okay, okay. So, that is correct. We want a lot of intramuscular fat, but we don't want a lot of other fat. Okay, so there's basically 2 kinds of fat on a beef animal. So, like I mentioned before, intramuscular fat or marbling would be all of those little white pieces. Sometimes they almost look like little dots or just little tiny bits of tissue, little streaks. That's the fat called marbling, and that's within the muscle itself. And that's actually really good. The more of that, the better. But then this fat out here and any other extra fat that's outside of the muscle. So it accumulates in various different parts of the body, but that's generally considered a bad thing because most of that gets trimmed away and we don't really use to sell to the restaurants or to grocery stores. So that's almost considered a little bit wasteful to have too much of that extra fat. Okay, so there's a thing called yield grade, and this gets a little complicated, but I'm going to try to keep it simple. Yield grade basically is a comparison of the amount of fat to the amount of muscle, or vice versa. Compare the amount of muscle to the amount of fat. And they do this based on some measurements. So these four things, and we've already looked at some pictures of these things. These four things are used to calculate a yield grade. And it's just a big math problem. But we take hot carcass weight, the ribeye area, the fat cover, and then that kph number, and we put it into this equation. Now this is just kind of for reference. I don't expect you to remember that equation, but that's the equation to figure a yield grade. And if you notice, everything that has to do with fat percentage, or weight of the animal, that's all positive. So we're adding those things to one another. And then ribeye area, which has to do with the muscularity of the animal, we're subtracting. Now we're going to get an answer that ranges from 1 to 5. What do you think would be better, a higher number or a lower number? Any guesses?
No one's brave enough to speak out loud. You can put it in the chat box.
That's true. You can put it in the chat.
Higher.
Okay. Why it says higher? So actually this one's kind of not what you would expect because of the way they did this equation. Everything that has to do with fat is a positive, and then this thing that has to do with muscle is a negative. So actually a lower yield grade is better. So we're going to look at an example here. There's two pictures. This is the same calf, just two different pictures. You've got a side view and a rear view, and that's a beef of merit competitor at the state fair. And then this is just kind of a random feedlot steer. And they're very different. So the more muscular the animal is, or the leaner the animal is, the lower the yield grade number. And that would be more desirable to have a lower number, okay? So this calf here was a really muscular calf, really lean. He's got a big hind quarter, a big top, so he's got a big ribeye muscle. And he's really not all that fat, okay? He would probably be a yield grade 2, maybe even a yield grade 1. Now, the fatter the animal, or the smaller the animal's muscles, the higher the yield grade would be. So this guy here is not very muscular. Probably a pretty small ribeye, and he's pretty fat. I mean, you can just tell by looking, he's pretty chunky. He's got a lot of fat down here in the brisket area. He's starting to make a little pocket of fat here on the side of the tail, and that's a good sign that he's finished, that he's fat enough. And he might even be a touch fatter than we would like. He's probably a yield grade 4, okay? 3, of course, would be right in the middle and then be pretty average. So I love this picture. This came from Certified Angus Beef, and it really does a nice job of comparing what a ribeye looks like from a yield grade 3 and from a yield grade 5. Now, I'm going to make you participate again, and if you don't want to talk, that's okay. You can type into chat if you'd like. But I want you to look for some differences between these two pictures. Differences between this ribeye and this ribeye.
Number 3 has more meat.
Okay, that's a good one. Number 3 has more meat. Anything else? There's probably 2 other differences that I can see.
Number
Friendly
5
says the fat on 5 looks more red.
Okay, that's a good observation. I actually didn't notice that myself. It does. There is a little discoloration to the fat. It almost has a red or a pink tinge to it. Wyatt, did you have something else to add?
5 has a lot more fat.
Okay. Which kind of fat?
The bad fat.
Okay. Does it have more of the good fat too?
Yeah.
Yep, it does. So that's a pretty good job, guys. These are 2 very different carcasses. So the yield grade 3 has a much bigger ribeye, less fat, which we usually would measure right around here. But it also has less marbling or less intramuscular fat, okay? Now, if we look at this one, much smaller ribeye size. Okay, I'm trying to outline it here with my little pointer. But this fat is much thicker and there's a lot more marbling here. Okay. Now the question is, and you guys can help me out here, which one do you want to eat? Which one is going to be best for Christmas dinner?
3.
Okay, I've got 1 vote for 3. There's actually no right or wrong answer here. So in my mind, if I'm selling a carcass, this one might be better, the yield grade 3. There's less waste there. The calf was probably more efficient throughout the time that it was on feed. And that's certainly a good looking ribeye. It's probably a choice. There's enough marbling there that I think it would be really good. Now this yield grade 5 is interesting. No doubt there's going to be a lot of waste when we trim away this fat. And this will be a smaller portion size. So maybe part of the answer depends on how hungry we are. But this should be a really high quality steak. That's probably prime. There's a lot of marbling there. And so maybe just as give or take, it's a personal opinion on how big you want your steak to be, how much marbling you want it to have. Maybe some of that depends on how you would prepare it. But those would both be pretty good steaks. Okay, so we've touched on this a little bit, but the quality grade thing is the next component. Basically, we sorted out into 4 different categories: prime, choice, select, or standard. and that all depends on how much marbling is there. So it's super simple. The USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, makes little cards, little laminated pictures, and we simply use them for comparison. So when I judge like county fair carcasses, I actually have a set of those cards, and I just go in and sort through them and try to make, you know, the comparison of the real carcass to the card, and just judge this the best I can. And so it's a little hard to see on the computer, but these two, moderately abundant and slightly abundant, those would be prime carcasses, and they would have the most marbling. And then we just kind of step down from there. So this would be upper choice, and then modest would be average choice. A small amount of marbling would be low choice. A slight amount would be select. And then actually there would be one more step down, which would be like just traces or basically zero marbling, and that would be called standard. Okay. And this is just a chart that breaks it down. You could ignore everything to the right of this dotted line. We're kind of focused on what they call maturity A, and that would be all the animals that are under 30 months of age. And so if we're talking about 4-H projects, for instance, most of them are easily under even 24 months of age. Okay, so we're going to be just in this column right here. And it pretty much describes what we just described about the pictures. So abundant marbling would be prime. Moderate, modest, or small amounts would be choice. Just a slight amount would be select. And then if it's just a trace of marbling or zero marbling, we call that standard. So historically, we've done this just with a person. A USDA grader would just look at the carcasses and kind of judge this the best they could. These days, they do it with a digital camera. And so this is kind of a cool picture. This is the kind of the realistic picture. And then here they've highlighted with the digital camera and kind of color coded things. So the red is the ribeye muscle, that's the steak muscle. And the white pieces, the white streaks, would be your marbling or your intramuscular fat. The yellow is the bad fat or the cover fat. And then that blue area is actually showing about where they measure the back fat. So usually it's about 3/4 of the length of the ribeye measured from this side here. So right about here is where they measure that back fat. Then of course, if they've got this in a digital camera, the computer can just like automatically take in those measurements and calculate a yield grade for you. So not everybody would use this equation, but if you do enter a carcass contest through the 4-H program, whether that be county fair or state fair, it's very likely we would use this equation to rank your animals and evaluate them. And it's called retail value per day on feed. And again, it's another long, complicated equation. I don't expect you to remember the actual equation, but hopefully it helps explain the concept. So we take the carcass weight at the end minus an estimated beginning carcass weight. We know from research that at weigh-in time, and you're probably getting ready for, you know, county fair weigh-ins are typically around Christmas time. Calves are going to be 400 to 700 or 800 pounds, depending. We know that at that starting weight, about 55% of their body weight would be actual carcass weight. So we just use that as an estimated starting carcass weight. And then we multiply that by the percent retail product, which is calculated using all those same measurements that we use to calculate yield grade. It's this kind of the same kind of deal. It's just trying to estimate how much actual muscle product is there. And then we multiply that by carcass price. And I'm going to show you here in a few minutes, but carcass price varies a lot depending on the quality grade and the yield grade of the carcass. And then we divide that by days on feed. And depending on the market, it's usually, you know, somewhere between $3 and $6 of retail value per day on feed. And so whoever has the highest value would win that contest. The reason that we use that is because it's been shown to be a pretty good indicator of profitability. So it helps you determine if you're actually going to make money with your animal. It tries to incorporate not only those carcass traits that we just talked about, but also how quickly does the animal gain weight. So we want them to gain pretty quickly, right? So do you guys know approximately how much a calf should gain every day? If you're feeding a calf so a market calf, from like Christmas time until fair time, how much weight should it gain every day?
3 pounds.
Okay, Wyatt says 3 pounds. Anybody else? £3 is a pretty good answer. Industry average for steers is probably 3.5 pounds, and for heifers would be just a little less than that. Within reason, really in terms of average daily gain, more is better. So if you get your calf to gain 4.5 pounds, that's awesome. Usually they have kind of a minimum average daily gain that you need to get to be eligible for a blue ribbon. And usually that's like a 2 or a 2.1, 2.2, somewhere in there. So at the very least, you want them to gain that 2 pounds a day or just a little more. But really, you should be shooting for probably 3.5 pounds a day. Okay, so the question then is, how do we get our animals to achieve really, really good carcass quality? And there's a few different things here that are part of that. Genetics, nutrition, health, low stress handling, and then marketing at the right time. Those are all part of achieving really good carcass quality. I put this picture up here because I think we need to remember that this is really the whole point of our project. We're raising food animals, and we want to make a food product that's really good, healthy, wholesome, nutritious. You know, it tastes really good and people want to buy it. So that's the goal. And I always kind of remind people, we can get caught up in 4-H sometimes with, you know, which calf has the biggest butt and which calf has the best hair and which calf is the prettiest. At the end of the day, that stuff is not as important as these carcass traits that we're talking about right now. Okay, so genetics. Genetics is a term that refers to the traits that an animal has based on the DNA from mom and dad. Okay, so from the cow and the bull. And these calves in these pictures are from the McNay farm, which is an Iowa State research farm in southern Iowa. And they are, I can't remember exactly what time of year this was and whether they're spring or fall born calves, but they're basically just recently weaned, and they're going out onto some cover crops to do some grazing. They probably weigh, you know, 400 to 500 pounds on average. This herd of cattle, in my mind, is pretty average in some ways, maybe even below average in some ways. But they're part of a long-term breeding project where we have selected aggressively for marbling and for intramuscular fat production. And so it's really interesting, but these calves, even right now at 500 pounds, some of them might have enough marbling to grade choice. And definitely as we put them on feed and feed them like a market animal, they would be very, very likely to grade choice or better. And I think we've had deals where, you know, almost all of them were upper choice and we had lots of primes and stuff like that. Now, nutrition is another big part of this. And in order for an animal to grow well, to gain quickly, to lay down a lot of intramuscular fat, we have to feed them really well. The first thing is they need enough energy and enough protein. And especially as they get bigger and heavier, protein's usually not quite as important as energy. I guess what I mean there is it's easier to meet protein needs and energy becomes kind of the limiting factor. So what do we feed them to provide energy?
Corn and hay.
Okay, corn and hay. Now, hay does a few different things. It's a good source of roughage, sometimes a good source of protein. Depending on the quality, you know, it could be a good source of energy. Corn is like number one in my mind. When I'm thinking of an energy source in Iowa, corn is the first thing I think of. It's got tons of energy. We've got a lot of it in the state of Iowa, and it's usually pretty economical. So it's really common for feedlot calves or market animals to get a lot of corn in their diet. Another thing that they've shown with research is that starting them on corn or some other high energy feed kind of early, so maybe it's early weaning or creep feeding or something like that, that can actually help them make more intramuscular fat and more marbling. Market at the appropriate degree of finish. We'll touch on that more in a second. The other thing there I mentioned, be careful about implants and feed additives. So implants are little pellets of hormones that you put under the skin of the ear, and they help the cattle to gain better and grow more quickly. And they really work well. They're efficient. They're a good investment. But if you were to use like a really aggressive implant really close to slaughter, it can actually decrease the carcass quality just a little bit. So you just have to kind of be smart about managing that. And there's a few things you can add to the feed that can kind of do some similar things. So health is another thing. It's really important to protect their health, vaccinate them, provide, you know, fresh, clean water, shelter, you know, keep them away from sick animals, things like that. Because actually sickness during the feeding period decreases carcass quality. Like every time they're sick, they kind of put their energy and protein towards their immune system and towards healing, and maybe not as much toward growth. And it actually does decrease carcass quality over time. And there's lots of studies. I listed 2 of them here, but you know, of course you can have animals die if they get sick, but then also you can have some that just don't gain well, they don't grow well, their meat quality decreases as opposed to what you'd expect, and they're just not as valuable. And then I mentioned stress. So stress has some negative impacts on animals. It can decrease the immune function And your immune system, remember, it protects you from infections. And that's true in animals too, animals and humans. And so decreased immune function means you're more likely to get sick or catch an infection. Stress decreases average daily gain and feed efficiency. And it also causes this thing called dark cutters. So kind of the same picture here on this slide, but dark cutters are caused by what they call a depletion of glycogen. And that's a fancy way of saying that we've lost sugar. Okay, so animals generally store extra sugar in their muscle tissue. And when the animal's slaughtered, that kind of reacts with the air and it turns that meat to the normal bright red that you'd expect. And when an animal is stressed before slaughter, basically they kind of burn up that extra sugar that should be stored in the muscle. And then the meat looks dark. So it looks like this picture on the left. Now, I think they've shown a shorter shelf life for dark cutter beef and maybe some really slight differences in like texture. But big picture, it's still good to eat. It still tastes pretty good. It's still perfectly safe. But it doesn't sell very well because it looks not appetizing, right? It looks like it's maybe old or spoiled or something like that, because we're used to seeing meat that looks like this. So dark cutter beef gets discounted quite a bit at the packing plant. And we do see some 4-H calves every fall that are dark cutters and get discounted. So I put this slide on here, probably targeting a little more intermediate or senior 4-Hers. So this might be kind of advanced for you youngsters. But what we're trying to show here is that marbling and external fat don't get deposited on the animal at the same rate. So this pink line is showing that the marbling kind of accumulates just gradually over time in a straight line. But the external fat is more of a curve like this. And so early in the feeding period, when the animal's younger and lighter weight, most of the energy is going toward growth and muscle development, and very little is put toward external fat cover. And then as they get older and more mature, they stop growing in terms of frame size and muscle development, and then they start putting their energy towards fat, okay? And so it's kind of a tricky game. I think it was Brinley earlier answered that fat was both good and bad. It becomes kind of a tricky thing to have as much marbling as possible and as little cover fat as possible. And genetics is a big part of that. So let's assume that this red line is the amount of marbling we need for the animal to grade choice, okay? And this seems pretty reasonable right over here. We're kind of getting to a reasonable amount of cover fat and marbling fat about the same time, okay? Now I want you to consider another animal. This green line would represent animals with lots of good marbling potential, kind of like those calves from McNay that I told you about. And so with this, they actually reach choice much quicker. Excuse me, much more quickly in the feeding period. And they do so without accumulating very much external fat, okay? Now the next calf I want you to think about is one that has less genetic potential for marbling. This calf we've got to feed for a long time, way out here on the timeline. And you got to imagine this cover fat curve would actually be way up here somewhere. This calf would be very fat by the time he had enough marbling to be choice, okay? I know that's kind of complicated, but hopefully you appreciate that marbling and the cover fat don't accumulate at the same rate. Okay, so you guys help me out here. What's going on in this picture? Any volunteers?
She's feeling the ribs.
Okay, why is she doing that?
To feel how covered he is.
Exactly, yep. So this is a cattle show, right? And the judge usually will put a hand on the calf's ribs and maybe up kind of by the top of the back. And they're trying to find out how much cover fat there is. And they're feeling for a couple other things too, maybe. They might try to feel like how big that ribeye muscle feels under the skin. But a lot of what they're doing is trying to determine how fat the animal is. So, how much fat do you think is ideal? So I'll give you an estimate. On this yield grade 3 that we talked about, there's probably a 1/2 inch of back fat. And on this yield grade 5 that we talked about, there's probably 1 inch of back fat there. So how much do you think is ideal?
1 inch to 3/4.
Okay, got a vote for maybe 3/4 or so. Anybody else? So what I usually tell people is about a 1/2 inch. Now, it depends on the animal, and I'm going to show you some really cool examples coming up here. But most of the time, if you can get a 1/2 inch of back fat on them, if they have the genetic potential to marble, that's enough that they should display or exhibit that marbling potential, and they should grade pretty well. So now the reason this becomes important is because of something called grid marketing. So these are actual numbers from the week of August 3rd, 2020. So this was last fall, or yeah, this previous fall. And these are some numbers that we used they were from Tyson in Dakota City. These cattle were marketed through a program where we collected carcass data and they were paid on the grid. And this is kind of the grid that was used. And so the base price is here. Okay, so that's for a low choice yield grade 3, which we consider kind of average or kind of minimum expectation. It's a perfectly good, marketable quality product, but it's like nothing extreme, okay? The base price was $162, and when they put /CWT like that, that means per hundredweight. So that's per 100 pounds of carcass weight. So as a quick example, in this scenario, if you sold a calf that weighed, if the hot carcass weight was 800 pounds, then the check that you would get would be 162 times 8. That's how you would calculate the base price or the base gross income. It'd be 162 times 8 because there are 8 100 weights in that carcass weight. Okay, so that's your base price. That's kind of the starting point. And then you get premiums or discounts based on a couple different things. And first, we'll talk about yield grade. So we told you earlier that a lower yield grade number was better. So a yield grade 2 would get a $2.50 discount per hundredweight. And a yield grade 1 would get a $6.50 premium per hundredweight. So that's extra money that you add on top of that $162 base price. Now, on the flip side of that, if you are a yield grade 4 or a yield grade 5, you actually get discounted and we lose money. So the yield grade 4 discount is $8 a hundredweight, and the yield grade 5 is $12 a hundredweight plus lack of some other premiums. Okay. Now, the other thing is you can get premiums and discounts based on that quality grade thing. So CAB stands for Certified Angus Beef, and basically that's for average choice or upper choice. Okay, we call that upper 2/3 choice. So if we can get to that level, we can get an extra $4 a hundredweight. And these numbers always vary by the season and by the year. This is just a snapshot in time from what was going on this August. But the prime premium in this example is $13 a hundredweight. Now, 2 years ago, the prime premium was really big, and it was in some cases $35 or $40 a hundredweight, which adds up very quickly. Now, if we only grade select, we get discounted. If we only get to standard, we get discounted a lot more. And then if our calf is a dark cutter, we get a really big discount. They also do some discounts for carcasses that are too big or too small. Usually they want them to be like right in that range of like 600 pounds to about 1,000 pounds. Discounts are usually like anything below 550 or 600 and anything above 1,050 pounds. Okay, so now's the fun part. These are real examples from the State Fair Beef of Merit show. And these cattle get shown at the state fair, they get judged live, then they go to slaughter at Tyson in Dakota City, and we get the carcass data back. And then for the last couple of years, the other thing that we've done, we requested from Tyson that they send us the actual digital images of the ribeyes. So we've got those pictures as well. So it's kind of neat. You can look at the calf live, and then we can look at those ribeye pictures and look at the numbers and kind of see how things go. So this particular calf, what do you guys think of him? Is he good? Any thoughts on him? All right, so I'm gonna give you my 2 cents and show you the results on this one. Now, you guys, if you don't mind, get ready because I'm gonna have you participate a little bit here. So these are his numbers. He was a yield grade 3.19. He was upper choice. He had 0.7 inches of back fat, and his ribeye area was 15.4 square inches, which is pretty good. Typically, that number is going to be between 10 and 16. We don't necessarily want it to be huge, so it doesn't have to be 17 or 18 or anything like that. But we would like to have, personally, I'd like to have it be probably over 12. So this is pretty good for a ribeye area. And then this is what his pictures looked like of his ribeyes. So you actually have both sides. The color is a little funny here because it's kind of a sheltered camera. It's in, I think, kind of a stainless steel hood, and it has to angle down in that that wedge between the ribeyes and the ribs. But this is your back fat. Same deal, the ribeye muscle looks kind of red, and the white within that is the marbling. So that's a pretty good result for that calf. And he actually gained pretty well too, and he did really well at the contest. So this is another example. His numbers are a little different, but still pretty good. He graded choice. Now it's interesting, when they do yield grades, we typically talk about them in whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And you guys probably learn in school how to round a decimal number, right? So a 2.98 would round up to 3, right? Because it's above 2.5. But they don't do the yield grades that way. They simply just cut off the decimal number and they go with the first digit as the whole number yield grade. So this calf, even though he was just by the narrowest of margins below 3, he gets called a yield grade 2. So he gets that premium. Not quite as fat as the previous calf. Ribeye is a little bit smaller. But this calf also did very well. And those are his ribeye pictures. Okay, now the next calf, a little bit different breeding. He maybe looks similar in a lot of ways, but to me he looks more muscular and a little bigger framed. He's maybe more Simmental or Limousine in his breed. And these are his numbers. So he has a lower yield grade. So he must be pretty lean, right? Pretty muscular. Not a lot of marbling if he's a select. Part of the reason why he has such a low yield grade number is because his ribeye area is so big. He's got almost a 17-inch ribeye, which is really big. So hopefully you can see when you look at these pictures, there's just not very much marbling in those steaks. And there's just not very much cover fat here, or not as much as some of our previous pictures. And you can't really look at this side because they've accidentally cut off some fat there at that spot. But we'd have to kind of look over here to measure back fat. But he's got a big old ribeye, but not a lot of marbling, not a lot of cover. Okay, so this is back to that calf I told you about. I really like this calf. He's super thick, super muscular, nice and lean. And these are his ribeyes. So now you guys have to start participating. We've got probably 5 or 6 of these examples. So you guys get to do a quick judgment here. You can put in the chat or you can holler on the mic. Maybe give me a guess for yield grade and a guess for quality grade.
I think he might be a yield grade 2.
Okay. Is it Dylan?
Yes.
Okay. Dylan says maybe a yield grade 2. Any thoughts on quality grade? All right. So,
I think that'd be choice.
okay. You think choice. So let's take a look here. Those are pretty good guesses, Dylan, and really a pretty good steer. There's enough marbling there to be low choice. Now, he would have been, you know, even better if we could have maybe got just a little more fat on him and a little more intramuscular fat within that muscle. Remember I told you that the ideal back fat is usually about a half an inch? His back fat measurement was 0.34. So I look at that and I say, well, if we could have fed him for another 3 weeks, could we have gotten him to a back fat measurement of 0.5? And would that have bumped him up from a low choice to an average choice? Maybe, okay? Because that measurement was pretty small, and because he has a big ribeye, he was actually a yield grade 1.97, which was almost right on the dot of the 2 that Dylan guessed. But remember, we don't round it correctly. We just call him a 1. So he would actually get a $6.50 per hundredweight premium based on that grid I just showed you a couple minutes ago. Okay. So another calf, again, a state fair calf. I think he was a purebred Angus. Not quite as muscular as that previous calf. You know, not the big hind quarter or the big top. But he looks like a pretty solid calf. He looks like he is finished or getting close. He's starting to put a little fat pocket here by the tail head. And you can see that on either side here. And these are his ribeyes. So any guesses on him? What do you think for yield grade and quality grade?
0.6.
Can you say that again, Brinley?
0.6.
0.6? Okay, so 0.6 for your back fat measurement. That's probably close. What do we think about quality? Is there enough marbling there?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's really good in that regard. So these are his numbers. You were close, Brinley. His back fat measurement was almost 0.5. It was 0.48. And he had enough marbling to grade prime. Okay. If I were to change him at all, I would maybe want his ribeye to be a little bigger. But man, that's a really good carcass, right? Anytime we can do prime, that's really good. And that's just because he's got so much marbling kind of mixed into that muscle. Okay. Now, I'm curious what you're going to say about this calf. This guy was a really big, tall, like big framed calf. In some ways, he looks similar to the first 2 or 3 calves we looked at. But it's a little misleading because when you look at his ribeyes, they're pretty small and he's really fat. So any thoughts about quality grade?
Select.
Okay. So why do you say select, Wyatt?
Because he has a lot of fat.
Okay, so let's see. The fat that he has is going to have definitely a big impact on quality and yield grade. But it's actually, he's got enough intramuscular fat, it's going to swing him the other way, if that makes sense. So what's a quality grade that would have a lot of intramuscular fat?
Prime or choice.
Good, very good. Now, what's the bad thing though? With all this cover fat, what's his yield grade number going to be like?
Three or four.
Okay, good. So you're on the right track. That lets me know you're kind of getting it. But this calf was extreme. So look at his numbers. He was a prime, so you did a good job with that. And you were on the right track. He was going to have a higher yield grade number. He's actually a 5. He's got two things hurting him. One is he's got almost an inch of back fat on him. And he's got a smaller ribeye. Okay. Extremely good quality, right? But we'd just like to have him maybe with a little bigger ribeye and a little less back fat. Okay, so this one here is just an example, I think, of just a pretty solid calf, pretty average numbers. I won't make you predict him. Choice, 0.6 of back fat, yield grade 3.5. And then I might have one more of those just kind of showing pretty average solid calf. Those are the ribeye pictures. This one was upper choice, but again, 0.6 of back fat, yield grade 3.5. That's kind of a target for just a good solid calf, okay? Now, what do you think of this guy? Is he pretty muscular?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's got a lot of muscle in his hindquarters, pretty big top. The judge would probably say he wants him to be a little deeper in the flank. He's starting to put a little fat around that tail head. You see that little bulge of tissue like just right beside the tail? Okay. These are his ribeyes. So do you notice anything unique about them? It's maybe hard without the others to compare to, but they actually look darker in color than the other pictures that we've seen. Brinley, did you have a comment?
No.
Okay. So this calf was pretty good. Low choice, yield grade 2, almost a ½ inch of back fat, which is about right. His only real problem was the darker color of his steaks. And they actually did call him a dark cutter. And so he got discounted a little bit for that, despite all of his other numbers being pretty good, okay? Now, we say stress causes dark cutters, which the research shows, but it's really hard to predict. A lot of times we don't know exactly what caused the stress, or we may never have noticed that the animal was stressed. And I've seen the other way too. I've seen animals that were obviously stressed out prior to slaughter and their steaks look pretty normal. So it's really a hard thing to predict. Okay, so this calf is interesting. To me, he's a very nice, stylish calf. He balances up well. He's pretty thick, pretty muscular. Nice strong top, pretty thick hindquarters. He just looks like a solid calf, but he looks a little skinny to me. So I can kind of see his ribs just a little bit right here. And we don't see any fat pockets by his tail head. It's hard on this angle, but he probably doesn't have a lot of fat down here in the brisket. So for some reason, in the cattle industry, when the animals are kind of skinny or kind of thin, they sometimes call them green, like the color, G-R-E-E-N. So to me, this calf looks like he's a really high quality calf. He's just really green, okay? And this is the picture, or the pictures of the ribeyes, okay? These are carcass pictures. What do you notice?
Very
Black color and there's not much marbling.
Okay, not much marbling. Did you say something else about color, Dylan?
Yeah, it was a lighter color.
Okay, lighter color than the previous one. Wyatt, did you have anything else to add?
not much fat and no marbling.
Okay, not much cover fat and basically zero marbling, right? Maybe we'd say trace. There's a couple little streaks of marbling, but it's pretty faint. So these are his numbers. He's a yield grade 1, but such a lack of marbling that they called him a standard. Not very much back fat. And ribeye area is pretty reasonable. So what do you think about that calf? What could we do to improve his outcome?
Feed him longer and maybe some more.
Yeah, absolutely. So he just needs more feed. Now, I don't know what they fed him or how much they fed him. Maybe they could have fed him a different diet, maybe more energy, more corn. Maybe he needed more pounds of feed per day. Or maybe he's just really an inefficient calf, and maybe he was eating a really solid diet, but just was slow to put on pounds. And maybe he just needs more time, okay? But either way, he's not quite fat enough to be ready for market. Okay, and then there's this guy. Hopefully you can appreciate this guy is fat. He's a pretty good steer. He's got some style. He's got a nice straight top, pretty thick hindquarters. He's definitely putting pockets of fat on either side of the tail head. If we had a front view of down between the front legs where you could see the brisket, he was putting a lot of fat down in the brisket area too. I guess I got the numbers before the pictures on this one. So he was a low choice, yield grade 4, and again, almost 1 inch of back fat. Now, when I think about a calf like this, I don't know if he had maybe as much marbling potential enough genetic potential for marbling as I would like. And the reason I say that is because he's got almost an inch of back fat and he's a low choice. And it may not all be about genetics. Maybe he was sick at one time. Maybe there were some stressors during the feeding period at some time. But man, if we've got an inch of back fat, I really want that to be prime, or at least upper choice, right? So a good steer in a lot of ways, but I want to see more marbling to go with that amount of back fat. Okay, how you guys doing? Are you hanging in there?
Yep.
Chelsea, are we supposed to be done at 7:30?
No, I think I had said around 8 probably that we would be done, so you're good.
Oh, okay, okay. Okay, so I've got a few slides here about record keeping. This isn't quite as exciting as the carcass stuff, but it's important. And then we'll probably be done a little early and I'll just open it up for questions. But we're gonna start with this record keeping stuff. So have you guys ever heard that saying, if it isn't recorded, it didn't happen?
No.
Some of you maybe have, some maybe you haven't yet. It's a common saying, and it always bothered me because it's not true, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff that happens that I don't record, that I don't write down, and it sure happened. But the point of this is that it's hard for us to remember the details of when and how. And I've got a pretty good memory, but there are still lots of things that I don't record, thinking to myself, oh, I'll remember that. And then I don't. At some point I forget it, or I forget at least a little bit of the details, or I get it confused with another memory or another piece of information. And that's just human nature. That happens. And so that kind of helps us figure out why this record keeping thing is important. So part of record keeping is cattle identification. Now, if you're dealing with just a handful of 4-H calves, or maybe you only have one calf, cattle identification is pretty easy, right? You know who is who. Sometimes they've got a name. We know exactly what they look like. But what if you had 100 head of black Angus calves? It might be really important to have tag numbers or brands or tattoos, something to help identify them. So there's different ways to do that. A lot of people use ear tags around the Midwest. If you go out west, they do more freeze brands and more hot brands. The hot brands aren't necessarily unique for each animal. They're more unique for a farm. But hopefully you guys can appreciate some of the different options there for identifying animals. So one really important thing then, and I talk about this with clients, I teach beef quality assurance training sometimes, and we talk about it in that training. As a veterinarian, this is a really important one to me, but anytime that you have to treat an animal, so by treat, we mean give them a medicine. And that could be a pill, it could be an injection, it could be a pour-on, it could be an implant. But anytime that we give a medicine of some kind, it's really important to record these pieces of information. And part of the big picture here is that anytime we give a medicine, there should be a withdrawal time noted on the label. So that's the time gap required between when we give the medicine and when they can safely be slaughtered, or in the case of dairy animals, when they can safely give milk for consumption. Okay. The idea is we don't want those medicines to show up in the milk or the meat. So we have to give the body time to kind of process and get rid of the medicine. And to make sure that we do that, it's really important. And I think the FDA recommends there's, I think 8 or 9 things here, but this is kind of the minimum that you should record every time you treat an animal. So you record the product that you used, the animal or the group of animals, the date, the dose, which is how much medicine you gave, route of administration, which is just a fancy way of saying how you gave it. So did you give a pill? Did you give a sub-Q injection in the neck? You want to put the name of the person who gave the medicine. And then on the bottle, you should be able to find the withdrawal time. And then actually they do two pieces of information about withdrawal time. So first you write the length of withdrawal time, and then you should put the date and maybe even the time that the withdrawal time would end. And it's after that date and time that you could safely sell the animal. And then if you've got any written directions from a vet, so maybe you've got a prescription or a VFD or anything like that, you'd maybe want to record something about that. Okay. So the recommendation is to keep those records for 2 years after you sell the animal. Okay, so you're really supposed to keep some of these records for some of your 4-H paperwork as well. And let's say that you do go ahead and record this when you give your animal a treatment. Maybe they need an antibiotic, or you do an implant or a wormer or whatever. You should then keep these records for 2 years after the date that you sell the animal. Okay, and that's a long time, but it's important in case we ever have to come back and talk about this or revisit this. There's other information that you may want to include that can be helpful. And I've listed some of them here. If you can ever put a product number or a serial number, the location of the injection if you're giving shots, the weight of the animal, or at least the average weight of a group. And there's a few other details there that you can include if you want to. Okay, so this is just an example of what treatment records could look like. And so my suggestion is to get something that has kind of a chart like this to make it more easy for you, so that you don't have to think about those 8 or 9 pieces of information every time you treat an animal. You just simply fill out the chart. And there are some things that you can get a hold of that have these. I think BQA probably has some documents that are kind of set up and pre-made. I know the Iowa Beef Center put together a calving book a few years ago that is really a nice little book, and it's got lots of good reference things in it. And in addition to having references and treatment records, or I'm sorry, calving record charts, it's got these treatment record charts as well. So you could go right into that book and find charts that look just like this and fill in all the important pieces of information. And not only do you want to keep records for those individual animals, so like these top charts, but even like vaccination appointments. So we call that processing. But maybe we're running through all of our animals and we're giving them you know, a couple vaccines and maybe some wormer or some, you know, external parasite treatment, maybe implants, whatever the case might be. Maybe we don't keep track of these animals one by one, but we still want to somehow describe the group and then put down some of those really important pieces of information. So I always like to remind people about some of these big management things too. And, you know, there's not necessarily a chart that's pre-made for all of this. Sometimes it may be easiest just to use a calendar and to just jot down notes on specific dates on the calendar. But it can be really helpful to record at least the date and maybe some other important details if you've got stuff to add for some of these really important management things. And it's interesting, you may not think they're important at the time, but often down the road, whether you're filling out a record book, whether you're doing taxes, whether you're trying to figure out when your calves are due to be born, you know, sometime down the road, you may want to think about these things. So if you AI cows or heifers, you want to write down the date that happened. Maybe when you turned the bull out, maybe when you weaned, maybe when you offered creep feed, perhaps you moved to a new pasture or to a cornstalk field. Maybe you changed something about the diet or added a supplement. Just try to at least note the date and then maybe a couple other details if relevant. Okay, so feed records are another thing. You really should record some things about your feed. So, you know, what feeds you feed, how much you give. If you do any feed testing to look for nutritional value, you want to keep those results. At the big feedlots, someone goes through every morning and does a bunk score. And that helps determine whether or not we need to give them more feed. And so, you know, maybe you don't do an official bunk score, but you at least make a note that the animal cleaned up their food or not. Or maybe you kind of go day to day assuming that they pretty well cleaned it up. But if there happens to be one morning where you go out to feed and there's a lot of feed left in the bunk, maybe you make a note about that. For feeds that you buy, you should probably keep like receipts and invoices and things. And then definitely if you have a VFD, which is kind of like a prescription for any antibiotic that you're going to add into the feed, you're required to keep those VFD records for 2 years. And again, on this, I would try to make it simple. Like obviously, I'm probably not going to go out every day and describe exactly how much of every feed I gave, especially if it was the same as yesterday, right? But maybe I just simplify it somehow. Maybe I make up a ration or a diet. You know, I work with my nutritionist, my parents, my vet, whoever. I come up with this diet and I just name it. Let's call it ration number 1. And maybe I've just got a calendar or a chart of some kind. And every day that I feed, I just go write ration number 1 on the calendar. And then at some point, I'm probably going to want to change that ration. Maybe they get bigger. We're trying to get more average daily gain. We crank it up a little bit and give them more corn. Maybe I'm going to call that ration 2. And so now on my calendar, I just write ration 2. You know, something like that. Just some kind of record would really be good. And then finally, some notes about business records. And you guys are young yet, but sometime down the road, you know, you may have to deal with loans and taxes and things like that. It's good to kind of get in that habit of thinking about keeping some records. Anytime you buy or sell an animal, anytime you're buying or selling feed, equipment, try to keep some notes, maybe keep receipts, invoices, maybe at least mark down, dollar amounts and dates. Certainly if you've got any official paperwork from the bank, you want to keep a hold of that. Keep receipts for payments that you make, and try to keep track of your inventory of things a little bit. So I know that sounds overwhelming, right? It's like, Chris, do you really want me to keep track of everything I ever do with my 4-H livestock? I don't expect it to be perfect, but I do think it's a really good idea to get started trying to keep some records. And I know every county's different. I don't know if you guys all do record books or not, but I can tell you from experience, when I was your age, record books are really hard if you don't keep records during the year. And they wind up being very inaccurate, right? You start kind of guessing and estimating, and pretty soon the records that you're turning in really don't mean a lot. So if you can actually write some things down and keep some receipts and just practice. I think when you go to do record books, if you do those, I think you'll appreciate it. So, okay. So I feel like I've been talking an awful lot. We are done just a hair early. But let's open it up for questions. Like, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to learn about, or anything that I need to explain again or explain better? You guys let me know.
Should we give our calves?
Can you repeat that, Brinley?
Should we give dewormers to our calves?
Can you give dewormer to your calves?
Should we?
Should you? So when it comes to any medicine question, I'm probably going to say to talk to your regular veterinarian and get their advice. When it comes to dewormer, it kind of depends on their setting and on their history. So most of the time, animals pick up the most worms when they graze, like out on pasture. And the worm larvae, or the little baby worms, are actually like down on the grass. And the animals eat them when they're eating the grass or grazing. So, let's say you got a calf this fall or this winter that has been out on pasture, maybe hasn't been dewormed since being on pasture. I would probably recommend at least 1 dose of dewormer. Now, maybe they've been dewormed already, and since then they've not been out on pasture. Maybe you're going to feed them more like in a lot. In that case, you might not need to deworm. The risk of worms for feedlot cattle is pretty minimal, because they're not grazing, they're just eating from the bunk. So it kind of just depends, but like if I buy a new calf in the fall that's coming off of pasture, I usually want to give them at least 1 dose of dewormer to kind of get them started.
We feed out of the bunk and a little bit of grazing.
Okay. So yeah, if you're doing a little bit of grazing, you might deworm occasionally. You don't have to do it like super frequently. And the other thing is, it depends on how many other animals they're grazing with. I mean, if they're grazing with a big herd, many in that herd could be shedding worm eggs. if it's like just your 4-H calves and you've dewormed them a time or two, they might be pretty clean. Even with a little bit of grazing, there may be very little need. So.
When should we wean a calf?
That's a good question. So when should you wean? Usually we wean when they're about 6 or 7 months old. But it doesn't have to be exact. You can wean them much earlier than that, like in the case of a drought, or if the cow stops milking well, or she's getting really thin. We sometimes wean as early as 4 months old. Some people have a strategy where they actually just kind of leave them on the cow for longer and let the cow naturally wean the calf. But most common practice is to wean right about 6 or 7 months of age.
How many pounds of protein per calf?
Oh, how many pounds of protein per calf? I always struggle to answer that in pounds. I usually think in terms of percent. So like on your young calves, lightweight calves, they might need 14 or 15% protein. As we get them a little bit bigger and heavier, we can turn that down a little bit. And like on a finishing diet, we may only need like 10 or 11% protein. I always have to run it through my computer program. I've got a computer program that I use to balance diets, and it kind of depends on how big and how heavy the calf is, and then on how much feed they're eating. And that's something, you know, if you want me to work on that for you sometime, you can have your parents call me or email me or something, and we can like plug in your details into the computer, and we can figure out if you need more or less protein.
Yeah, that's about what we're doing.
What's that?
That's about what we're doing.
Okay, perfect. So you guys help me out here. Brinley, I'll let you start. Do you have steers or heifers?
We have 2 heifers and a steer.
And
Two heifers and a steer.
then
And then a pregnant heifer. So a cow.
Okay. So will you do like a cow-calf project with her then for next year?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
We have some steers, heifers, and a couple peppers. Now,
You're a little hard to hear, Dylan, but it sounds like a little bit of everything, some steers, heifers, and maybe a cow.
yeah,
Okay, very good.
This year I'll have 2 steers.
2 steers. Okay. It's always kind of fun to do these programs, and then I like to get out to county fairs when I can, and sometimes I'll recognize the name or recognize the kid and actually get a look at your projects. That's always kind of fun. Well, do you guys have any other questions for me? So my question for you, did you learn anything?
Yes.
Okay, got at least one yes.
Yeah.
It's always hard, especially on Zoom. I can't maybe interact the same way, but it sounded like you guys were hanging in there with me.
It was really
Chris, do you want to? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
really fun.
Good, good. Thank you.
It's good to hear. Chris, do you want to put up your contact information again, maybe? Was that did you have that in the beginning of the slides?
I don't know. Did I?
I don't remember.
I don't think I had.
I don't remember. I stared at it for a while, but
Let's see. Why don't I stop sharing and I'll put it in the chat?
that sounds like a good idea. So while he's doing that, I want to say thank you for joining us. A few of the people that signed up weren't able to be on tonight. So this is being recorded, like I said earlier. So I will get this downloaded onto my laptop, and then I probably will upload it onto our Marshall County Iowa State Extension YouTube channel, and then send you guys that link for you guys to watch in the future, anytime if you guys want to look back.
Yeah, and so there's my email and phone number. Feel free to call or email. You know, my job is to really just be a resource and to help beef producers. So if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know.
And I will make sure to send that too in the follow-up email to everyone, since there's going to be some people that are going to watch just the replay. So you guys can have that written down in the email if you don't quite capture it tonight. So I will send that out again. But thanks again for joining us, guys. It was a lot of fun. I'm glad you guys learned some stuff.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Brinley's dad. We really enjoyed it. It was really good. It was fun.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So it's good to hear when it's a small group, but yet people learn and enjoyed it, because you never know with a small group. So that's really good to hear.
I'm a teacher too. It's hard. It's over Zoom and all that stuff. It's been difficult, but you did a great job of presenting, and it was fantastic. Brinley really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Here. All right. Well, if no one has anything else, then we'll let you guys go for the night, and I'll send some follow-up emails tomorrow.
Thank you.
You're
All right.
welcome.
See you guys. Thank you.
Bye, guys.